the things I value most as a Montessori parent is how well the teachers know my child. They know his strengths, they know his challenges, they know his favorite and least favorite materials. They know when he needs a little bit more encouragement, and they know when to lay off. They know who his friends are. They know what he thinks of his friends and how they solve their conflicts. They know what his favorite movies are. They probably know what his favorite TV ads are. They probably know who his favorite YouTubers are. They just know who he is in every aspect of his being. And they know my son just as well as they know every other child in their care. And the reason they can do that is because they spend so little time teaching, and they spend so much time supervising from a distance and conversing with the students and engaging in so many different exciting endeavors and asking questions and answering questions. And most importantly, they spend a lot of time observing, supervising from a distance, and conversing with the students and engaging in so many different exciting endeavors and asking questions and answering questions. And most importantly, they spend a lot of time observing. Observation is the key to the implementation of a solid Montessori program. But what is observation, and how do we become observers? Observation, the term itself, the way it's used in the great wild world out there, is usually about seeing, sensing, hearing, measurable, methodical, precisely recording, noting what is happening in a particular way. But what observation can be is transformative. To observe deeply is to know. To observe deeply is to be. It is to commune. It is to engage in the act of co-creation. That is a shift, a huge shift that the scientific community has made from understanding observation as seeing and measuring and so forth, to understanding observation as a transformative and interactive activity. Joe Galecki is a physicist at NASA, and he wrote an article called "The Observer in Modern Physics." In the article, he explains this shift in scientific ways of observation in this way. He says, "Let us ask a simple question. When you look up at night and you see a star, what is really going on?" A Newtonian philosopher might answer that you are really seeing the star because in Newtonian physics, the speed of light is reckoned as being infinite. An Einsteinian philosopher, on the other hand, would answer that you are seeing the star as it was in a past epoch, since light travels with finite velocity and therefore takes time to cross the gulf of space between the star and your eye. A quantum philosopher would answer that you are not seeing the star at all. The star sets up a condition that extends through space and time, an electromagnetic field. What you see as a star is actually the result of a quantum interaction between the local field and the retina of your eye. Energy is being absorbed from the field by your eye, and the local field is being modified as a result. This line of an argument brings us to an interesting notion, he says, that of the interaction boundary. Let us assume an observer and a system to be observed. Any observer and any system. Between them, imagine a boundary and call it an interaction boundary. The boundary is strictly mathematical. It has no physical reality. In order for the observers to learn about the system, they must cause at least one quantum of information, be that energy, momentum, spin, or what have you, to pass from themselves through the boundary. The quantum information is absorbed by the system, or it might be reflected back, and the system is thereby perturbed. Because it has undergone a perturbation, it causes another quantum of information to pass back through the boundary to the observer. The observation is the observer's subjective response to receiving this information. So we've gone from looking at a star as a star to looking at a star as old light that has traveled through space and time, to looking at the observation of a star as a quantum interaction that changes both the observer and the observed. That's the kind of shift I'm talking about that we need to make. Fritjof Capra puts it even more simply, describing the impact of the discovery that electrons can behave both as waves and particles. If I ask it, an electron, a particle question, it will give me a particle answer. If I ask it a wave question, it will be a wave answer. The electron does not have objective qualities independent of my mind. In atomic physics, the sharp Cartesian division between mind and matter can no longer be maintained. We can never speak about nature without, at the same time, speaking about ourselves. This idea of observation as being a relationship between observer and observed is one which Dr. Montessori would have been quite familiar with through her work and training in anthropology, and also in medicine, actually. But Dr. Montessori was writing long before any of the discoveries that led to these great men writing these wonderful things. She was firmly entrenched in the vocabulary and the ideology of the modern era, where Newton's laws still ruled. So it's really interesting because even though she's writing from that perspective, she expresses some distinctly transcendent ideas, and in these we get glimpses of her tremendous insight and intuition, which led her to make discoveries that have been corroborated again and again. In Education and Peace, for example, she says, "When I am with children, I am a nobody. And the greatest privilege I have when I approach them is to be able to forget that I even exist. For this has enabled me to see things that one would miss if one were somebody." Quite a shift from her earlier words on observation, where she talks about telling student teachers to tie themselves to chairs if they can't be still enough during observations, or from that lecture in 1915 where she was clearly focused on measurable behavior, even though at that point she was already referring to the inner preparation of the teacher for the work of observation. She said in that lecture, "We are after external facts which we can constantly see, but we must little by little divest ourselves of old habits. The old habits of acting a great deal, and of talking much, and of contenting oneself with words, that which can make us easily fall into delusion and error." Contrast that to these words written in the observant mind many years later. The first step an intending Montessori teacher must take is to prepare herself. For one thing, she must keep her imagination alive. For while in traditional schools the teacher sees the immediate behavior of her pupils, knowing that she must look after them and what she has to teach, the Montessori teacher is constantly to look for a child who is not yet there. This is the main point of difference. The teacher, when she begins to work in our schools, must have a kind of faith that the child will reveal himself through work. She must free herself from all preconceived ideas concerning the levels at which the children may be. The many different types of children, meaning they are more or less deviated, must not worry her. In her imagination, she sees that single, normalized type which lives in a world of spirit. So we see that Montessori's ideas on observation evolved, just as they did in the realm of physics, from a focus on what is physically observable and the aim of objectivity, to include ideas of observing the self and examining one's own assumptions and prejudices, and finally, to seeing observation as a highly spiritual endeavor that must involve the imagination of the observer. These ideas of Dr. Montessori's were no doubt influenced by her training in medicine and in anthropology, as well as by her very active spiritual life, both in the Catholic Church and her interest in the Theosophical Society, among others. But what Dr. Montessori never got around to doing was to telling us how to create the circumstances in which an adult could be transformed into an observer. Beyond telling trainers that they need to confront their students with their faults and telling teachers to tie themselves to chairs if they can't stay still. So my personal development as an observer has been highly influenced by my own mother's trainer, Cato Hanrath, who ran a 2-year training program where the first year was dedicated to learning about art, culture, psychology, philosophy, anthropology, and all of these wonderful things for the adults. Nan seems to have taken Dr. Montessori's words from the Spontaneous Activity in Education really literally, where Dr. Montessori says, "I would initiate teachers into the observation of the most simple forms of living things. I would make them microscopists. I would give them the knowledge of plants and train them to observe their physiology. And I would not have them concerned with theory alone, but I would encourage them to work independently in laboratories and in the bosom of free nature." So Nan took this and made it a reality for her students. And some of her students who have become trainers in their own right, including my mother, have brought this around to the next generation of students as well as they can within the limitations of their own training programs. So what Nan did was she first had her students sit down and observe a plant, just as Dr. Montessori said. And she had them observe insects, just as Dr. Montessori said. One of the activities that I hear the most about from people who have trained in this way is the trip to the zoo. So we're sent to the zoo, and the first thing we need to do is to observe the enclosure that the animal is in, once we choose an animal that we feel connected with. So first we observe the enclosure. For a good 15-20 minutes we are observing an enclosure, pointing out where the fences are and what kind of ground there is and what's available for the animal to interact with. Once we've finished that, then we can actually observe the animal itself. And this was one of the keys in Nan's observation practices, is that you are not allowed to name the animal. You have to describe the animal in as objective as language as possible. Because in this way, you are distancing yourself from the idea of what that animal is or what that animal represents for you. So we have observed the enclosure, and now we are observing this animal, which we're not allowed to name. And, you know, its various appendages and movements, shapes, colors, textures, whatever. And once we've done that for another good 20 minutes or so, then we are set to analyze a repetitive motion made by the animal. And really honing in on that one little thing and getting down to every single detail of that one motion. And you can imagine what an appreciation that brings when going back to the classroom and examining practical life activities, for example, for economy of movement. So the zoo is one of the most transformative experiences for a lot of people. Another one is that we were sent to a museum, and in the museum we had to again observe the space within which the piece that we decided to observe is displayed. And once we've observed the room, the space, then we can observe the piece itself. And then once we're done observing the piece itself, then we get to observe the people who walk in and out of that room, how they interact with that piece of art. Once we could do all of that kind of observation, once we had developed the skills to take in something that was not necessarily interesting to us, something that we could describe in objective terms, then and only then were we actually allowed to observe human beings, but adult human beings. And only after we had observed adult human beings in several different environments, then we were allowed to actually start observing children. The format we used throughout all of these observations is, I think, a really brilliant one. And I believe it was developed by Nan herself. I haven't been able to find any evidence to the contrary, and everyone I've asked has always pointed in her direction. This is the running record. Now, a running record is a way of writing down what is happening as it is happening. And what makes this unique are several pieces. One is the line that separates the objective observation from the subjective observation. And the other is this little section right here. Our name, the date, the day of the week, the time of day, the weather, and our emotional state. Once we have gotten that down, then we may begin our observation. And this is the really key piece, is that on this side, we write down the time every 10 minutes or so, or however often we feel we need to. And as we are writing what we are observing, on this side over here, on the smaller side, we're writing down whatever comes up inside of us. Whatever we're feeling, sensing, thinking, anything that comes up for us gets written over here. That is an incredibly powerful way of expressing and externalizing our own emotional responses. The other important piece is that at the end of every observation, we were asked to write a short reflection, in this case one sentence, about how the entire observation went. It's fairly clear from what I've talked about already that my training in observation was far deeper than what most trainings offer. And when I went into the classroom, I did it kind of mostly sometimes when I could, when I remembered, when I wasn't too busy trying to get through every lesson and worrying about every child and going through everything that every first year teacher goes through. But it was after a few years in the classroom, when I did the TIES Master's program, that I was able to really become an observer. The returning to the guided practice and returning to the theory at a deeper level and connecting both of those and putting them in the context of systemic thinking that really brought together all of the different pieces for me. And that's when I realized the absolute genius of Nan's exercises. When we observe the animal's enclosure, and then the animal, and then the repetitive motion of the animal, we can see so clearly how the environment impacts the animal and the animal's ability to move. When we observe the room in which an art piece is displayed, and then the art piece, and then the people who interact with it, we can see how all three of those elements work together to create a whole experience. And that is what we're doing for the child. The child is greatly impacted by the environment. And so when we're learning how to observe, by learning to observe environments, we are indirectly preparing ourselves to prepare environments with that interaction in mind. A little bit less obviously, perhaps, we are also deeply impacted by our environment. And that's the genius in writing down the day of the week, the time, and the weather, because these are all environmental factors that impact us as adults, as practitioners, as parts of the living environment. Using these tools and engaging in these practices forced me to see judgments and assumptions that I did not know I had. When I am in observation, I am able to step outside of myself for a moment And in doing so, I can see what is in front of me with a much greater clarity. This awareness and this ability to separate what is happening inside of me and what's happening outside of me, and to see them working in concert, this has changed my reality in ways that were absolutely inconceivable before it happened. To change my own world so deeply, to willingly engage in that every day as a Montessori practitioner, requires a great deal of humility. It requires courage. It requires faith that the change will bring forth a better world, and enough love for the child to be willing to undergo that process, and a belief in the potentiality of that child and the world that they will bring forth with them. Now, I talked earlier about how scientists approach observation as a dynamic process, and Montessori kind of did, and how I developed that feeling for observation as a dynamic process. It's also seen in psychoanalysis. Mario Montessori Jr. was himself a psychoanalyst of great renown, and he said that because Montessori, like psychoanalysis, works from the child to the theory rather than the other way around, that Montessori teachers are like psychoanalysts. He says they acknowledge the diversity of factors determining human development and behavior. They endeavor to cope with them in the concordance with the findings obtained by observations of spontaneous behavior that would otherwise not manifest themselves with the same clarity and continuity. This makes it possible to study phenomena not noticed before, including the existence of a dynamic unconscious of which they are the observable manifestations, and forces the scientist to be an observer and participant concurrently. In both the psychoanalytic and the Montessori approach, the relation of observer-participant and active participant should be one of alliance based on mutual respect and confidence. The observer-participant should be carefully trained. He should be interested in the phenomena he is observing and understand them. He should allow situation to develop freely, abstaining from intervention when it is not necessary, and acting appropriately when it is. His actions should be determined by the situation and its objectives, never by his own impulses or wishes, which might interfere with the process at hand. Similarly, Suzanne Short, Jungian psychoanalyst and Montessori teacher, writes, "If the teacher knows herself, then she is free to know the child." Jung stated it directly. Both parties in an interaction change. The teacher and the child both change, for theirs is an interactive environment. If we don't know ourselves well enough, and if there is a lot of darkness around us, we become chaotic. Therefore, it is incumbent upon the teacher to know as much as possible about herself, so that the child can discover who it is. What the child responds to is not your suggestion, but you. Thus, good therapy or good teaching is not technique or method exclusively. It is simply being. This resonates so strongly with the Montessori tenet that who we are is the biggest lesson we will ever teach. We all carry our stories that are activated when we work with children. Stories of things that happened to us, that happened around us, that we did, that we loved. They stay with us. We know this because we've studied the absorbent mind, so we know that when we had an absorbent mind, when we were children under the age of 6, we were absorbing the environment around us, and it became a part of our very souls. So we carry that around with us all the time, and when we work with children, it very naturally comes up. The thing, though, is that these things that we carry with us, these stories, these responses, they have the potential to block our vision of the child, of both the universal child and of that particular child that is standing in front of us this very moment. If we are engaging in our own inner battle or basking in the inner glow of our own beautiful memories, we're not seeing that child. This is Magritte's famous painting, The Treachery of Images. It reads, "Ceci n'est pas une pipe." This is not a pipe. Magritte, who was a surrealist painter, wanted viewers to question their perceptions of the world around them. It is said that when challenged on the statement, "This is not a pipe," Magritte answered, "You should try filling it with tobacco then." But surely we human beings were smarter than that, right? I mean, we know that that's not actually a pipe, right? Even a young child can tell you the difference between make-believe and reality. They certainly seem to know that they can't eat the orange that, appears dancing on YouTube. There is still this thing that happens to us because we human beings, we like to think that we're very smart and very evolved, but our brains haven't really evolved all that much since we became Homo sapiens. Most of our brain functions without our awareness, just like the rest of our body. It's on autopilot, and it responds automatically to stimuli. If you see a pipe, you see a pipe. I see that image of the pipe, and my brain automatically associates that image with everything I know about the pipe. For me, it's remembering a really sunny afternoon on the grass sometime in my early childhood in a park with my father laying down on his arm, and he had the pipe in his mouth. It's the smell of my great uncle's study, and it's the different flavors of tobacco that my friend and I tried in university. And I know about pipes, I know about their construction, I know that there's a stem and a bowl and they're hollow and they're used for smoking. And so when I see The Treachery of Images, all of that is working somewhere in my brain, whether or not I'm conscious of it. And a pipe is a reasonably simple object that doesn't carry all that much weight. So what happens in my mind, without my awareness, when I see a child? When I ask, what is a child? What happens when I see a child on a swing? What happens to you when you see a child learning how to ride a bicycle? Or when you watch a child struggle to learn how to tie his shoes? Or when you watch a child struggle to answer math equations? Knowing our responses helps us to clear them out and to be able to see that child. When I was in training, I was chosen to be the child when our teacher was showing us how to do the folding claws presentation. And I sat down next to her on the tiny little table, and she brought out these little cloths, and I looked at them and I'm like, we had these in my classroom. I remember them, they were exactly like this, only they were so much bigger. And I felt this warmth and this just such a good, happy feeling. And my trainer looked at me and she said, they weren't bigger, you were smaller. When we have all of these associations, all of these memories and these felt body sensations, but we don't know they're there still impacting what we do and how we do it. When we can bring them to the forefront, when we can become aware of them, then we can see that the child in front of us is not us. That's not us when we were kids. This is a new child, full of new potentialities, with their own history, their own biology, their own magic. What it comes down to then is we have to understand ourselves, to understand the child, and understand our reactions in order to become the teachers that we have the potential to be. How do we do that, though? Well, the answer is observation. How do we become these fabulous observers? Suzanne Short, whose article I read from earlier, says one way of doing this would be to enter into psychoanalytic analysis, to enter into that process of confronting our childhoods and remembering our childhoods and bringing that up so that we can be clean. The other thing she says we need to do is to take care of our inner child. We still have our inner child in front of us, and we have to take care of our inner child too. One of my favorite Montessorians, Aileen Wolf, wrote an entire book about this called Nurturing the Spirit. And her basic thrust is that we need to examine our own childhoods. We need to understand where we were let down. We need to understand where we were supported. We need to understand where those things impact us now. And we need to nurture our own spirits. We need to take care of ourselves. We need to feed ourselves, our souls. We need to make sure that we take in beauty for ourselves, that we have things outside of our jobs that give us joy and passion and that feed our love. In my own trainings, these were things that were very heavily emphasized. We did a lot of reflections, drawings, artistic expressions, journal writing, poetry, all of these things, reflecting on our experiences of learning, of blocked learning, of early childhood, of adolescence, of classrooms, of family. All of that is great and wonderful, but to get us going here in this fabulous seminar, I am going to invite you to join me in a very simple exercise to just dip your toes into the water of observation of inner and outer worlds simultaneously. Very simple 3-step exercise. Step 1, notice when a child, any child, at home, in the world, in the classroom, any child, anywhere. And if you don't have a child, an animal or another adult human being, notice when that child starts to pay attention to something. That's step 1, just notice. Step 2, let them. Step 3, notice what happens to you. What thoughts do you hear? What urges do you feel in your body? What emotions emerge? I am really interested in hearing back from you. What happened when you tried this little exercise? And I'm really looking forward to engaging with you over the course of the next week.